evening, everyone. I hope we're coming in loud and clear. Happy to have you back tonight, sir. How are you doing?
Hey, well, I'm always happy to be here. This is fun. I really enjoy your show most times. I have to apologize. I don't catch them all the time, but you know what? This is the only place that I know of where you can get anything that even resembles this. And no, I have fun. Plus, you're great company. You really are. Always have a good time talking with you.
Likewise, sir. That's why I like having you on when you can make it, and I appreciate you coming in tonight because we've got a biopic script to talk about, um, and it delves into a little bit of Hollywood history, and I think you're definitely a good person on that because you're good at picking up interesting character traits and what better time period to take a look at some very horrible type of characters than the one that this script is going to be addressing.
Oh, yeah. It makes me appreciate good people that have to wade in that society, which makes me appreciate people like you who have to wade in that society. Oh,
Yeah, it's gonna be I this is gonna have some good conversation here. So without further ado, let's get started with the show. Please let us know in the chat if everything's come through, no echo or not. I know there's an echo an episode or so back, which did not exist on my export, but for some reason did on YouTube, what have you. With that being said, welcome to Scripts on Saturdays, the only screenplay review show on the interwebs discussing scripts both professional and amateur, circulating around Hollywood, giving you, the TV and movie-going audience, a behind-the-scenes and inside track on what writers are pushing and what producers are buying. I am your host, the Script Doctor, and joining me this week is Adega of Adega Outlaw. So happy to have you back, sir.
always fun.
We've got a biopic. It takes place during post World War II. Hollywood was a
Right.
pretty divisive time at that point. This is the screenplay called Kazan, and this is
Kazan, yeah.
written by Chris Parizo, who has no full credits to his portfolio yet, but he did place on the blacklist a few years ago, and he's placed again this year. Would you please share with us the logline for Kazan?
I certainly will. The story of the tumultuous relationship between Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan, born out of the success of Death of a Salesman, and destroyed when Eliza Khan named names to the House Committee on Un-American Activities, resulting in two of the greatest works of the 20th century, The Crucible and On the Waterfront.
Yes, and the synopsis is as follows. Elia Kazan rises from Broadway's golden age to Hollywood's ruthless arena, where he confronts the Red Scare's chilling grip. As friendships fracture and the House Un-American Committee looms, Kazan must choose between his art and his integrity, risking everything for a shot at cinematic immortality. Betrayals unfold, secrets unravel, and the pursuit of an Oscar leads to a dramatic showdown with fate as Kazan's name becomes synonymous with both genius and controversy. So, I will say this: the logline and the synopsis have a lot more energy than this script. um,
Yeah, yeah. This reminds me of my middle school years when we're trying to learn history.
yes, because
It was sleepy.
it that's the problem. It's like this is a period of Hollywood history that is actually quite entertaining, and yet, I mean, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but a lot of the moments in this script just did not kind of convey that interest to me.
Right,
Um,
right.
I mean, one of the things that I kind of appreciate the risk for with regards to this writer is that he's taking a handful of characters to focus on and showing them as being horrible human beings, which to varying degrees they were, and trying to create a story where your audience doesn't quite like your main character or your group of characters is a really difficult thing to pull off. Um, Rarely do you see that going well, at least in movies that do make it to production and release. I struggle to think of a character that you absolutely despise from the beginning all the way to the end, but still enjoy the movie. It's a hard thing to pick out of the air if you've been seeing a lot of film or television shows.
Yeah, no, I can't think of any either. Not one. And frankly, if there was any, it would be something that, like, there's one that people really have a good time with. It was, uh, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was the therapist, and well, I'll remember it some other time. Either way, what about what's his face? He was a psycho patient of.
Are you
I
talking about like
can't
What
even
About
remember.
Bob or no?
That's What About Bob. I couldn't stand that movie, and
Yeah.
people love it, but it just I couldn't stand Bob, and it was so unnerving. Any story like that where one of the main actors it sets me off, especially with like this script here. It's very hard to follow,
It
But
was
again,
tricky to follow because so it starts. I mean, this starts in like what 1946,
yes,
Broadway. There, it's
big success.
Elia Kazan when he's like in his early 30s. He's directing the debut of Death of a Salesman, written by Arthur Miller, and he's getting things all like refined, and he's revered in New York as a brilliant Broadway director. But one thing that kind of irks him, and he learns this from some of the producers and other people around town, is that it's never his name big in lights under the
Right,
marquee. It's always Arthur Miller's because he's the playwright. He's in New York.
right.
They laud the writer, and the director is just directing traffic from their perspective. Where across the street you see on the marquee for Cecil B. DeMille, in 6 foot letters, for his latest picture, and Hollywood, and that's where you get the contrast with, and even some characters from LA that come out to see the Death of a Salesman stage play make that connection. They say in New York the writer's king, and in LA it's the director. And where do you want to be for your career? Do you want to be the king of Broadway that people forget, or the king of Hollywood that lives in perpetual, it lives in perpetuity? And that's what really kind of kicks off this story is Kazan, with the success of Death of a Salesman, and with some of the cast members there, he gets to go out to L.A. But before that big change, we get a first act that focuses on the friendship between Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan. And I was wondering, like, how did you find that friendship like explored?
Well, I think I did sense in the writer of the script that there was the tension already to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to be honest with you, and this is what I brought up before, we even showed up, is the way this is written and getting away a little bit from the characters. It took me a while to understand the rhythm and the writing method of the person who put the script. And I needed to go back and go over the beginning again just so I could kind of understand it because this is the fifth one that we've worked on together.
Mm-hmm.
And out of those five, three of them were good scripts. One of them was a terrible script. And this one, it was just written in a way that I couldn't pull out anything from it. And maybe it was just because it was such a, I don't know. He did the setup where you pan on from, the curtains
Mm-hmm.
and you have Kazan or Kazan, starting to go through his little angst of not being the big man on the stage, his little envy of his friend Arthur. Um, but I think it seemed even at the very beginning, both of them seemed to be very shallow people.
Yes.
Their friendship was based on their own personal needs, not on true friends. And even later on, we'll get to in the story, they were, I guess the correct word would be opportunistic friends, where when they had the opportunity, They could drink together, they can laugh together, they can do things together, but they could also stab each other in the back real easy because they weren't true friends. Um,
Right.
so it seemed tenuous. You could already see the conflict right at the beginning getting ready to set in. And that's just history. That I can't say that was anything that had to do with the way it was written. Again, like I said, it was for me the rhythm of the writing was very awkward. Uh, just how he would set the scene and paint the picture. Uh,
Yeah.
it didn't work for me.
Well, I the way that I saw it was that it felt like there were isolated set pieces, like a handful of sequences back to back, but it was an isolated moment in time and didn't
Yes.
have a setup to the stuff that was following very loosely in some regards. Like one of the things that was one of the running themes throughout this script for Elia Kazan is his insecurity about being an immigrant. Like he doesn't consider himself properly American because he came over to America when he was only 3 years old. He married an American woman. He had American children. He changed his family changed his name to sound closer to American. Um, and you have like what I would call imposter syndrome that he's dealing with, but it's never really fully explored internally for this guy. It's all done on the external side of things, and I think that's where, from Arthur Miller's point of view, because I mean, well, the logline says this is about their friendship. There's huge portions of this script where Arthur Miller's not even mentioned or not even involved, and it's very
Right.
much more of a Kazan story, which I think
Right.
he should have leaned into more with the pitch of it. But it's really about his own insecurities, and what's sad is that even to this day, you will meet many people, whether they're writers, directors, or actors, that feel the same way, where the only validation they're going to get is through accolades and not the relationships that they build. I mean, I've what's oddly enough, like from my experience, I've made some friends where it did start as an opportunistic friendship, but then it actually like evolved into something that was legitimately real, like where we're sending gifts to family members,
Right. Right.
with each other, and just because it's something we do, and you developed a real friendship, but at the same time you never disassociate, you never mix that friendship with the business in the way where they're dependent on each other, because it's show business, not show friends, but the friends is something that comes usually as it's either a first thing that happens, and you stick with them, for ideally till the end of your days, or
Right.
it's business and you just have a friendly relationship that's business, and it's not anything more personal than that. Like, say for instance, like Penn and Teller, the famous magicians in Las Vegas. Those two guys, they barely talk to each other when they're not working, but when they're working, they are friends, and they know how to work well together. Those relationships, happen quite frequently. And then you got, say, a friendship like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. Those guys are good friends to the point where, even to the detriment of their own careers, they will help please the other person just because they don't want to have it break up the friendship. Hence Indiana Jones 4, and the Crystal Skull. But this one here, we definitely see one where Kazan, as a stage director, never gets any notice unless he is doing an Arthur Miller play. And Arthur Miller, as great of a writer as he is, he's not someone that could be a director of the words that he writes or the words that other people write. They need each other to complete themselves as artists. And I thought that's
Right.
kind of pretty fascinating, but I wish they explored it more.
Right. Right. And to your point too, because being a doctor for so many years, um, I've had a lot of patients where you're friendly, you're there for business, you're there to make people feel better, get better, do better. Um, but then every once in a while, there's that one that you run into where you could see the sincerity and the genuineness, and then it develops into a friendship. And these guys pretend to be friends, but it's fairly obvious that it was never anything other than, like you said, the codependency. I am in this relationship because you help me, not because I help you.
Right. And what I thought was kind of clever is that this is paralleled with the character called the Man from Detroit, and that's it's not his actual name. We don't know what his actual name is, but that's the name that they go by. And this is, of course, the
Right.
Communist Party at the time. And Kazan doesn't like him. It's literally, hit you over the face with a hammer that even though Kazan is willing to take his money, he does not like whatever certain bullying tactics that the Man from Detroit is implying with, you know, with his financing. So, for instance, they're working on a play called No Villain, which I
Hmm.
believe is an unproduced play from Arthur Miller, or maybe it was produced later. I can't remember because I did not have the time to go any further detail to it. But this is a play that they're working on that they're ready to debut. But for the Man from Detroit, it's too American,
Yep.
and he wants it to be a little less American. And then this insults Kazan because he's just like, no, like go to hell. He wants to tell him, go to hell and all this other stuff. But then the Man from Detroit says you also got to get rid of Arthur Miller because his dad, you know, owns a textile factory and he doesn't pay his 400 employees a livable wage. And Kazan's like, well, wait, you're punishing him because his dad's a jerk? Like, that's even worse because Arthur doesn't get any of that money yet. And the money that he does have is for his success as a playwright in New York, which at the time you could buy a very nice apartment in Manhattan, in the 1940s if you were a successful playwright. You made a killing.
Right.
And
Right.
then the directors, did pretty well, but nowhere near as well as the writers at that time. So there's a lot of you kind of pick up from the Man from Detroit how he has an ideology, but he doesn't have any sense of how the world works either. And I kind of appreciated that because I was worried that a script like this would try to make the Man from Detroit and people like him empathetic, as opposed to just ignorant and manipulative and bullying and whatnot.
Yeah, and I was kind of surprised at that too. I thought for sure that as soon as they introduced someone who's going to push the socialism or communist angle, uh, sorry, but coming from Hollywood as of late, it would seem like it would be one of the things that would be uh, built to where you would have a sympathetic character in that, and they never did that with him. He was always a dirtbag.
Yes. And the other part too, which I also thought was interesting, and it also kind of highlights a little bit of how Kazan is a hypocrite, is that he defends Arthur Miller not
Hmm.
on the morality of it, but on the fact that he needs Arthur Miller to be successful. Um, and I'm like, that's an interesting, like that's a personal motivation, an interesting one. Um, and and yeah, I thought, okay, so we have this guy who he's willing to defend his business partner because of financial reasons, and with a little bit of ethical behind it, but it's mostly on financial and reputational. And when they realize that they're not going to be able to finance this new play, that's when both Miller and Kazan get together, talk about how stupid the Man from Detroit is and what they're doing, and they come up with this personal story, which ends up becoming Death of a Salesman. And it takes them a year to get it in working order and get it on Broadway, and it's a huge hit. And this is what kind of starts everything off. And Arthur Miller's not the one that's asked to go to Hollywood to write more plays to turn them into movies. It's Kazan has said, "Hey, come to Hollywood. We want you to adapt something. We think it's going to be great, and we think you're the guy that can do it." And what he adapts is Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire that has
Hmm.
Marlon Brando in it, and I really enjoyed that movie. I also really enjoyed the play, and I'm in the very minority when it comes to the interpretation of it because I always look at Blanche Dubois as a liar the entire part of the play. She's the unreliable narrator and a liar, and everything that she says and does is to feed her own ego and desires. And of course, Stan is becomes a victim of those lies. And I
Well, I have to
always
take your word for it. I never saw either of those.
oh well, I mean, we can cover it a little bit because again, this is actually pertains to the script, but basically, um, Blanche Dubois, in Louisiana, which is under Napoleonic Code, uh, is under a great deal of debt, and because of Napoleonic Code, if your sister-in-law is under debt, that debt then transcends to the brother-in-law or whoever's the breadwinner. And Stanley is very worried about that because him and Stella have been married. They're deeply in love and they're expecting their first child. And then Blanche starts flirting with some various men. We find out that she's been kind of mischievous back home as a former teacher, possibly with a student. And at some point in the play, a little bit of spoilers, but at some point in the play, on the day of their kid's birth, Stanley comes home to celebrate, gets drunk, and then possibly assaults Blanche. And this is told from her perspective. And a lot of people that read that play, and even I think even Tennessee Williams probably said something similar to it, saying that that really happened. But it just seems so out of character because Stanley doesn't like her. He's sticking up for his friend who's dating Blanche and says that she's bad news. So for him to come home, to get some, change of clothes for his wife and himself, to go back and see his newborn child, only to stop and assault his sister-in-law, is so out of character that you're like, well, wait a minute,
Right.
is this real or not? Or is it just the fact that he went home, he gave her, read her the riot act for being an inconvenience and a blight on his family and putting them at risk. And when he left, she fabricated the attack and, played on the empathy of the people in society. And that's what ostracized Stanley from what he is. And you have that iconic scene of Marlon Brando screaming Stella outside because everyone's believing her lie and he doesn't know what to do. And I always look at it as like, well, yeah, she is the liar, and that lie has caused this domino effect of suffering for everyone else around. And she's broken a family because of that. And she's taken advantage of the kind-heartedness of the people in this town, so that she can, be victorious like a villain. And some people don't want to explore that possibility for it as well at all,
Yeah.
because it then says, this character that we're following, this Blanche Dubois character, is the hero, and they're like, she has to be the hero, she has to be the victim who's rise above and gets punishment for her attacker. But it's like, if it's all a lie, she's the villain. And Stanley, even though he's not the most polite guy in the world, all of his actions leading up to that point don't follow through with the action of what she claims to happen to him. And that's what makes it such an interesting play and also an interesting movie. One of the things I noticed that Elia Kazan did in the film is there's a mirror that breaks during the assault, but in the next scene, when Stanley's back and he's packing up, the mirror is perfectly fine. And you're like, oh, that's something interesting. that should be broken. So that's just kind of what he sort of did back then. He would take a play. He got such Kazan got such a huge reputation from that movie, and people loved it, and it kind of swept the Oscars, except for the fact that he did not win Best
Right.
Director. And this story
Right.
talks about that, and it has to do with two things. First being is that Cecil B. DeMille is very jealous of Elia Kazan because he's the new buck in town, getting all the accolades. And in order to take him down, he has hired private investigators, and he's taken advantage of Joseph McCarthy and his, what people in Hollywood called at the time a witch hunt for finding communists throughout all of politics, including entertainment, but mostly he was trying to do it in actual federal and state governments, and bled over into the entertainment industry, and Cecil B. DeMille is rumored to have been a key player in naming names, or at least telling people where to look. And in some cases, the people he told were communists, and others, the people he told that were communists were not communists, just someone that stepped on his toes, and he wanted them out of
Yep.
his way. and I was hoping this script would actually do that, because that's juicy, right? That's the parallel
That was my question too, is how accurate was that?
in the
'Cause I don't know
script.
that part of history. All I know is that when McCarthy was doing his thing both in Hollywood and in the government, he was hitting about 50-50. He was finding guilty people, but there was, like a lot of people said, there was a witch hunt aspect to it
Hmm.
where there was a lot of dominoes that fell on people that had nothing to do with it.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, as we said a little bit before the show, it's like he wasn't wrong in the fact that yes, the communists invaded the United States and a lot of parts of government and industry. He wasn't wrong for that, but uh, he was also became very paranoid as a result, and he was pointing fingers at people that were not communists and not part of
Hmm.
that. He pointed people at fingers at people who outright rejected and got in fights with communists because they hated communists, but he would accuse them of still being part of it. Um, to the point where he became obsessive, and then that obsession was, eventually built a reputation that made him a very unreliable individual with his quest to expose communists hiding
That was
within
my
America.
question, is if you
Yeah,
knew whether or not Cecil B. DeMille was actually that type of person.
I've
I
only
don't know
heard.
his story.
Yeah, I've only heard rumors that when if Cecil felt like his power was being threatened in town, he would quickly quash them by any means necessary. So I know that he had that fragile type of ego, thin skin
Okay,
type
so
of
then,
stuff.
then there's probably a lot of truth to it then.
I would say it's listen. I mean, it's really hard to get accurate accounts of directors in that time because their reputation outweighs the history itself, and you know these guys were magic makers of that time. If they wanted to craft their own narrative, they knew how to do it and they knew how to make it stick for generations. And the only people that would know the truth would be the ones that were there at the time, and if they chose to reveal that truth because they felt there'd be some advantage to them. And I would not be surprised if a lot of people just died with, you know, parroting the reputation that was probably, made and written for a lot of people in town, whether that was a positive reputation or a negative one, because there were directors that uh, they had the interviews of them. I think that played a lot in the 70s where they said, yeah, they were part of the Communist Party and then they left. And then by the time they'd already been out of that for a few years, but by the time McCarthy came to talk to them, it didn't matter that they had, basically rejected communism, that experience tainted them forever from his point of view. And he did everything he could to ruin their lives, or at least basically he did everything he could to ruin their lives after
Yeah,
the fact. And
yeah.
and some were able to persevere, some were not. Elia Kazan, this story is about him essentially kind of persevering because after he gets that loses the Academy Award, he no one, even though nothing has been exposed, there's been no evidence to say it. It's all based on someone else's word,
Hmm.
and that was another big controversy with um, McCarthyism. Is sometimes he just needed someone to say, yeah, he's a communist, and that was good enough for him. And
Yeah,
it's
there
like,
was no
well,
evidence, it was just hearsay, and the
yeah,
hearsay was enough.
and I mean, it was enough to get people scared, which
Hmm.
works. But I mean, the next logical step would be okay. Let's due diligence. Due process, gather the evidence, confirm that yes, this is their agenda, what they're trying to do, and that these are active participants in it. And for the most majority of the second act, it's really just we're seeing Kazan kind of lose his ability to make another picture, and he's struggling um, with the industry kind of softly rejecting him. Like they're not saying no, they're just not returning his calls. And we get a little bit of a tryst where he's meets and sleeps with Marilyn Monroe during a party, and and the way that they frame that scene, the way that they frame this party where people are celebrating, like yes, he's everything is kind of going his way and he's kind of on top of the world, and he's telling his wife Molly, who I think is kind of my favorite character in this script, even though we
Yeah,
don't see
yeah,
too much
she's a
of
good
her.
person.
Um, he's saying like, let's kick everybody out of the house so that you and I can spend the night together. And she's smitten and says, no, we can't do that to our guests. And then of course Kazan finds Norma Jean, aka Marilyn Monroe,
Yep.
and they go to the backseat of a car and uh, get jiggy with it. And then
Hmm.
he returns afterwards and rounds out the party. Um, but there were some other interesting notes that I thought were kind of fascinating. Like he knows his kids well enough that he enters the room in the middle of the night with a glass of water. He puts it by his son's nightstand, and within minutes, his son wakes up, takes a drink of water, puts it back, and goes back to bed. I'm like, that's an interesting character trait. Um,
Yeah, or noticing that his kids are actually paying attention when he was in the backyard, throws sand at the window to say, "Go back to bed."
yeah,
You know,
like
he knows his family.
he knows his family, and but you can see. But I really wish they explored more conflict in that, because in this part here, it's like he knows his family, and we've got these scenes that make you think, oh, he's probably a good father, but then we don't get enough with him and his kid. We don't get the stuff we get with his wife is contradicts his actions a lot, and it doesn't and it's not done in a way that makes us look at him as a hypocrite. It just makes us look at him like we're confused as to how the writer wants to express this version of Kazan on this page, and it's a little jarring.
That's a good point because that's something when in good writing is knowing the motivation of the person. And when you see him with the family here and there, but then you see him with Marilyn Monroe, it's not like there is any deep attachments. There's a knowing, but not a concerning or caring.
Mm-hmm.
The motivation behind the knowing, it was never spelled out. You can see it in her, he talks about her grimacing or smiling or working to help his friends or what have you, but um, the only thing he really gets painted as is mostly ambition.
Yeah, it's kind of one dimensional when he's trying to make it
Yep.
three dimensional, and I don't think that the elements for making him three dimensional land enough,
Right. Yep.
and I think that hurts it. Whereas Arthur Miller, he's also pretty thin too, because he's the type of guy who he's the writer that's never he's described as a writer that doesn't pay attention to the rules of writing, and not in the sense of like how to write a story, but in the business aspect of it. Because as things are getting terrible for Kazan, Arthur Miller has not been succeeding as a director or a playwright, in New York, but he's been reading these articles about this exploitation
Dock
that's going
workers.
on the dock work with the dock workers,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it's valid exploitation. Like that's the thing. It's not like the man from Detroit saying, "Oh, these guys need to do this," and it's greed and things that are holding it back. It's like, well, no, it's this is something different. This is not about changing. It's not about like crony capitalism or anything of that nature. It's about the fact that we're not fully recovered from the Second World War, and people still have to find their place, and there's limited work, and what do they do? Do they go home or do they go to the bar afterwards? And he's been reading these articles about how the mob is kind of putting pressure on some of these companies and all this stuff. And he started writing this play about it. And he decides he gets convinced by someone in New York to maybe go find Kazan, because the truth be told is they were never better financially than when they were together.
Right.
And that's what Arthur Miller does. He flies out to L.A. and he helps Kazan in a time of need by giving him some money. We don't know how much, but he gave him some money, and he said, "This is not a favor or an OU or anything. This is a gift, and this is the script that I'm working on." And Kazan reads it over, and he says, "This is fantastic," and he's excited, and he's like, "Okay, we can make this into a movie. You just got to kind of jazz it up a little bit, and we just got to get a producer on board and a studio that wants to do it." And we find out that Cecil B. DeMille and Ronald Reagan have kind of worked a little bit together to blacklist Kazan because of the suspicion of him being a communist, and he's saying no. So they end up going over to Columbia Pictures, and they broker a deal there. It's a backdoor deal where they can't talk about it, they can't advertise it yet, but here's the money, here's a house that we'll rent for Arthur Miller that he can stay in to finish the script to get it going, and the house happens to be right next door to Marilyn Monroe's place. and so
Yep.
and so Marilyn Monroe, of course, through her own personality, seduces Arthur Miller, and he now betrays his very Puritan wife back home, who
And that's something that I thought was lacking too, is because Miller, we don't, and I know the story is called Kazan. It's about
yeah,
Kazan. It's about him, but the part about him and making having a relationship with Marilyn and then losing the relationship with his family back home, it probably would have been a better situation if we knew more about his family life. It was very thin, and so I don't think the impact was there.
it
And
really wasn't. No.
there was also the aspect of Marilyn Monroe. If she was going to be in it, all we got of her was that she was a very flirtatious and effective bimbo.
Pretty much. Like we didn't get any character from her
No.
at all. She
So
was
these are
a sex
beats that I
object.
think we're missing out that could have added, other
Yes.
parts that could have been removed, but these parts would have given it more depth, a little bit more draw.
It would have given something, yeah, something meaty to chew on. I mean,
Hmm.
because it's like you've got, it's kind of relying on the fact that the audience needs to know who these celebrities were of Hollywood's golden age in order for you to buy in what he's doing with them. But yeah, he seems to forget that this was over 80 years ago. Like it's three generations removed essentially, and you're going to have a very small portion of your potential audience that's actually going to recognize these names in the roles that they played at the time. Um and for when you're writing a script, it's you kind of have to assume that this might be the first story that someone has ever read of these characters, whether they're based off of real people or not. And you don't have
Let's
to bog it down with like pages of exposition, but you got to give us something more to really
right.
figure out who these people are.
Again, it still gives me the feeling, like I mentioned early on, was that this is sitting in a grade school history class with a very dry professor trying to teach you history, instead of having the teacher who would help you be in those shoes and experience and smell the smells and see the sights and feel the feels, instead of just going through the dates and numbers and this person and that person, because there were a lot of people that were thrown in there that just came and went, and they had to, it seemed like absolutely nothing to do with the story except for take you from point A to point B, and then completely forgotten. It made no emotional impact.
No, it really didn't. I mean, there was little parts here and there where you're like, oh, I could see him trying, and I can see him doing, trying to, create that type of relationship with their dreams of being artists and why they're
Hmm.
artists because they're quoting like Shakespeare. They're quoting one of my favorite quotes from Voltaire, which is "Whoever condemns the
Hmm.
theater is an enemy to his country," because entertainment of that nature is how you showcase the success of your culture, right? Like if you're doing well, you want to advertise it. How do you advertise it? Well, you mythologize what you're doing so well in your home, and
To be honest with you,
yeah,
when you bring that up, that was probably one of my favorite parts of the whole script. Was then they were going back doing quotes from old authors.
yeah, and they
You know,
knew who those old authors were. I
yep,
mean,
yep.
I
You
can't
saw
tell you how
character
often I.
building. Yep.
No, go ahead, please. Yes.
No, no, it's just it seemed like there was a chance at having character building. You could see their intelligence. You know they were men well read. They had a little bit of back and forth between each other. You could see something kind of building there.
Hmm.
That's there was a string that was starting to be tied up, but then it was let go. But again, that was one of my, and that should not have been anywhere near one of my favorite points. It was just simply, it was one of the interesting ones.
It was, and it would have been nice if they were able to kind of keep that momentum.
Hmm.
Um, and the other part too is that like as Arthur Miller and Kazan are kind of getting back and forth together, like figuring out this new script, which Miller is calling the hook because these dock workers use
Right.
hooks and whatnot. He's talking about how it's like the dock workers are trying to unionize by themselves. They're not doing it through the mob. They're not doing it through the Communist Party. They're doing it to fight the injustice that's happening at the dock. And Arthur Miller's trying to make that as a very like a pro-American thing, which is fighting for freedom, fighting for the ability to negotiate what labor is worth. And of course, Kazan is saying, well, out here, people look at that as like pro-communist. And Arthur Miller has this little speech. He says, well, the 40-hour work week, is socialist. Minimum wage is socialist. Social Security, medical leave, America is socialist. And then Kazan is freaking out. It's like, shut the hell up. you know, um, because what you have here is you've got was actually kind of popular at the time, and it's why like the communist movement was able to go as far as it did between the 1920s and the 1960s. Is it's like, fairness and socialist is one thing from this perspective, but then the communists come in and they say, well, you have to be perfectly fair, right? And that's where you get into the whole, so perfectly fair means perfectly fair with outcomes, not fair with opportunity. And that's where everything gets bleeded through, and that's where everybody starts losing their minds. And then you've got the communists and their anti-capitalist perspective by saying, like, it can't be perfectly fair. And the capitalists saying, well, it's not about being fair at the end. It's about being fair at the start. So if you want to prove how fair you are, you got to put in the effort, and then the merit and yields rewards. And then that's how you build wealth. And that's how you have the American dream. And they're saying, well, everyone has to have it regardless. And the Americans and the capitalists are saying, well, no, like, you got to earn it. That's what makes it valuable, earning it. And I wish we got more of that debate in this, because they just kind of like bring it up and then toss it off. And that's, and
Yeah, because there
that's
could have
just
been a
how it
better
went.
explanation with it, because everything that he was attributing to communism wasn't. It had initially started off as capitalistic thing with Henry Ford.
Yeah.
The 40-hour work week, the wage so you can buy things, not a living wage, but it was a wage so that, you make a product, your people ought to be able to buy a product. That was all a capitalist thing.
Yeah,
And then the
and it had a
communists ran with
byproduct
it.
of helping stimulate the economy, because Ford was like,
Right.
well, if my employees can't afford my cars, then that's customers I'm losing out on.
Yep.
And and it's like, okay, yeah, that's how it works.
Yep.
So yeah, it was kind of unfortunate. I mean, like, this here, it just didn't resonate the way I wanted it to, and I'm just kind of skimming through the script because there's something I wanted to find, because we get a couple of scenes based on real events of these hearings, some of the public hearings.
Right.
So I'm just trying to see here. So we actually have one that's based off of Jeff Corey. So Jeff Corey was a filmmaker. His real name is Mr. Zwirling, and it doesn't sound exactly American, but there is records of him actually speaking to Joseph McCarthy, because I know that McCarthy didn't lead the stuff on Hollywood, but it was another guy that did it, but he was definitely the reason why the other guy, I think his name was Brewer, if I'm not mistaken. Someone in the chat will know.
Yeah.
But we have something that's actually kind of funny, which is that Jeff Corey is being accused of being a part of the Hollywood Communist Party, and Jeff Corey says the meetings that he attended in question were about sinking U-boats, and that in 1944 he was on board the USS Yorktown fighting a war, wanting to protect the freedoms of Americans in this great country. And then he throws back this really great question, which is that, but I never saw you there, Mr. McCarthy. Where were you in 44? Basically saying, okay, you want to prove how American you are. What were you doing, during the Second Great War? And Joseph McCarthy decides to basically say, you're not being cooperative, just dodging his retort, and basically saying you're hereby dismissed and good luck with your career in the future. And I'm like, that's pretty clever. Because it's basically saying, well, who's the real patriot there? Regardless of the political ideology, what are you fighting for? Are you fighting for your country? Jeff Corey's saying, I'm fighting for my country. This is what I was doing. I can prove this is where I was. Can you prove where you were, Mr. McCarthy? What were you doing during the Second World War? And it's kind of interesting to see that in this script that McCarthy doesn't do anything to affirm that he's patriotic other than pointing fingers at other people. And I think that's what kind of led to a lot of the tarnished reputation that McCarthy had in his quest to get rid of communists from inside the government and inside other industries.
Yeah.
And I'm like, as this writer, I'm like, this is a missed opportunity because you've got something that could be really juicy here, not just for the actors, but also for people who want to learn a little bit more about this point in time. So yeah, I mean, it's like you have a couple of peaks here, but at the same time, it's like, okay, you got Jeff Corey, who then becomes like an acting coach for teaching the Stanislavski method and whatnot, and we bounce into him with Kazan, but there's such empty scenes. It's like, oh, here he is teaching James Dean. Isn't that fun, guys? He's
Right,
teaching James
right.
Dean. It's like there's nothing more going on with it. Um, the script
But
does lose a lot of focus.
there was a second scene that I thought was really good, and I'm jumping a little bit forward, and I don't want to forget it because
Sure, go ahead.
there's a lot of forgetful stuff in here, and I know we probably both have the script pulled up.
Hmm.
Um, but it was when Kazan and his wife were on the beach, and they go into the bar where the brawl is,
Right.
and they watch and he says, "Oh, I know that guy," and they sit down and start talking and everything, and I can't remember his name, but he does say something that I thought was probably one of the better beats of the script was, you win the fight when they were afraid of you. If you were afraid of them, you lose the fight. And that pretty much painted the whole thing that Chasm was going through in Hollywood, and it paid off learning that lesson. I thought that was one of the better things about the script that needed to be there. Could have been played up a little bit more, but I actually like that.
So you're quoting Bud Schulberg. So Bud Schulberg is the writer of On the Waterfront. He's at so this is actually probably one of the more interesting parts of the story. It's actually a character that's way more
Right.
interestingly written than the everyone else. But so he basically says, yeah, the reason that you lose a fight is because the guy that you're fighting doesn't fear you.
Yep.
So I mean, and I found it here because Bud Schulberg is a guy who he he signed death warrants at Nuremberg, and he liberated Auschwitz, and he's been in a lot of fights, and he's been at the waterfront getting into fights with guys with dock
Hmm.
workers, um, and then chumming up with him afterwards, and he basically says this: you can beat any man if he fears you, but if you fear him, he'll knock your ass out every time. You didn't lose the Oscar because you're a communist. You lost it because nobody feared you. But oh boy, they
Right.
should now. And and this is kind of like this comes very late in the script. I mean, there's not much we can say do in the way of spoilers here because it's easy to look up.
Yeah, it's
uh,
history.
it's history. Um, but what we have here is like Bud Schulberg, his dad owned Paramount at the time. He has access to a lot of resources. But here's this type of guy who he's a veteran of the Second World War. He's tough as nails. He understands people. He understands relationships. And Arthur Miller is very jealous of him, uh, which is kind of funny because he says like, yeah, this is the guy. He's not really a good writer. He's just his daddy is so important. He can put his name on anyone else's script and take credit. And it's like, well, if you know a little bit about Bud Schulberg, you know that that's not really 100% true. But you definitely understand the jealousy and the controversy
Right.
that goes around with nepotism in the industry. But this comes after the fact that Kazan has been struggling for a year trying to get this script finished with Miller. Miller has it's funny. So you have the communists and you have Cecil B. DeMille's private eyes taking photos and surveilling both Kazan and Arthur Miller. They get photos of Arthur Miller in the throes of passion with Marilyn Monroe and use that to blackmail Miller. Then Kazan gets freaked out when a man from Detroit shows up and not only knows all the names of his family and has read the script that they're working on, but knows where he keeps his coffee in his kitchen. And it really gets under his skin to the point where he knows that he is going to be thrown under the bus. So the only thing that he can do is capitulate to this investigation and name names. And this causes a big problem for him in Hollywood because whoever he names whether they're communists or not, they're not going to work with him. They're going to basically just blacklist him and kick him out. And he's convinced by members of the federal government that if he does this, his career will be saved. And he falls for it. And so he names names. He thinks it's in a private session. It ends up being televised and then publicized and in the papers. And nobody wants to work with him. And what happens? Well, he ends up finding his way, at the docks, just dejected and feeling like he's never going to be able to do anything again. And he's mortgaged his house to finance a film that isn't ready yet. They don't even have a script until he runs into Bud Schulberg, who's beaten up, getting in a bar fight with 3 other guys. And that's where we get to this moment. This is like at the tail end of the script. Like, all we have is weird minutiae and scenes. Arthur Miller, he leaves his wife. He then marries Marilyn Monroe. They go back to New York. He's writing The Hook, and he's researching the Salem witch trials. And then Marilyn meets Joe DiMaggio. and then
she just goes where the excitement is. Whoever's the most brightest star at the time, she latches onto.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very casual. Like, there's no drama to it at all, which makes a screenplay that's pushing 120 pages feel really quick and really thin.
Mm-hmm.
And here I am in the last 20 pages of the screenplay, 25 pages of the screenplay, and we get to Bud Schulberg. I'm like, this is the most interesting character we've had so far in the screenplay.
Yep, I completely
next to
agree.
Molly, who is a character I absolutely adore. And we kind of rush through them doing Bud's version of the script, which is based off the same articles that Arthur Miller was reading in the newspaper. But these articles, the rights for them were purchased by Columbia Studios. And so, and this was one thing I thought was fascinating, that Arthur Miller didn't understand the concept of purchasing rights of stories with regards to article publications. Because even though Arthur Miller has made up all the characters and made up the situation, it's inspired by a journalist who has been reporting on these issues for many months, if not years. And in order to make things all legal, you kind of want to get the rights to those stories so that you don't have headaches afterwards. And Arthur Miller didn't understand that. And as a result, when Columbia was willing to invest in the script, they went ahead and bought the rights. And when Arthur and Kazan have that falling out over Marilyn and over their point of views and him naming names at the investigation, Kazan just teams up with Schulberg, who's like, yeah, I've written the script. I know how it's going to go. I know how to make it work. And the only thing stopping him is getting the green light. And Kazan says, I'm going to take the money that Arthur gave me and I'm going to buy the story rights and we're going to make this on our own. And this is the project called Crimes on the Waterfront. And they put it together. They managed to get Sam Spiegel to produce, and he's going by SP Eagle because he's embarrassed by his Jewish surname. And Kazan's like, screw that, use your real name. And so they get Brando on board, which Brando doesn't want to do because of the reputation that Kazan has made, naming names. But they managed to convince him, and also let him leave at 4:00 so we can go see his therapist, which I thought was a funny joke.
Yeah, I can't remember who they threatened him with. They said, "Oh well, Brando, you're okay, but we got a second person on the hook," and I can't remember who that other actor was.
Oh, it was Frank Sinatra.
Sinatra. That changed his mind.
And that changed his mind right away.
Take my
It's like, I hate Sinatra. He's a scumbag. So I mean, and so we get some juicy details about the making of On the Waterfront, and then they're just kind of glossed over. And then we go to a year later, and guess what? It sweeps the Oscars. He gets Best Director. He gets his trophy, and then Arthur Miller, meets him again, and they have it out. And there's a couple of punches thrown, and then Kazan says, you need to go back to your Puritanian wife because she was the best thing about you. and Miller makes a snide remark about Marilyn, and then of course Kazan, with his wife behind him and he doesn't know it, blurts out that he slept with Marilyn first, and that's the final straw for Molly, who's always suspected but never knew for sure, and she basically just leaves the wedding ring behind, and Kazan is kind of, you know, realizing that he sacrificed real meaning for basically an Academy Award.
Yeah.
And there's a moment here which I think was a little bit brilliant, but also completely wasted, where he has this type of smile that hides his anger, but like just a fake kind of Cheshire cat smile, and he
Hmm.
sees that in the reflection of the statue, which of course distorts face because of the way it's not a smooth surface. Um, and I'm like, oh, that would have been a cool image to capture, but it just feels so out of place with this story, because that's a far more brilliant reveal of the man inside, uh, the man behind the facade that Kazan puts up. It's like if we had more of Kazan being that type of duplicitous character, that hypocrite,
Yeah. The
that
setup could have
guy,
been a lot
this
better.
would
You
have
would have
worked
had
out
to feel
well.
for it more. Yeah.
And of course the screenplay ends with him meeting James Dean, who's very impressed with Kazan. He says, "You got a good name, kid. I can make it become a legend." And then we just get the old postscript archival footage stuff about Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which was inspired by the blacklist events in Hollywood. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that was also a great play. I think Daniel Day-Lewis kind of didn't get it, even though he won an Oscar for the performance. Because I've seen a dozen variations of that play, and Proctor's not the type of guy who's begging out of fear. He's a schemer, because the Proctor is essentially supposed to be Kazan, and he's supposed to be arguing with people. He's like, listen, tell them I said anything you want, but just let me keep my name. Like we're doing a negotiation here. I'll give you this, you give me that. We call it even. And then Daniel Day-Lewis plays it as begging, pleading. I'm terrified, and it's like you're trying to humanize Proctor, but he's not supposed to be a human character. He's supposed to be actually a very bad character. But okay, great, good on you, Danny. So what have you? But that's just my take on it there. So yeah, this is a very kind of scattered script. It starts off with trying to do no enemy, or sorry, no villain. Then a little bit of Death of the Salesman. Then we kind of skip over Streetcar Named Desire, just to go straight into the accolades of it. Then it's a competition of trying to get on the Waterfront Maid, and at the same time the Crucible is kind of being worked on in the background, and it appears like it could be linear when you kind of step back from it, but when you're getting from scene to scene and section to section, it's kind of all over the place. And one of the thoughts that kept popping up through my mind as I read this is, I think Chris Parizo watched Oppenheimer and said, I could do this for Kazan and Miller with the Blacklist. And
Now, was this written after Oppenheimer came out? That's
yeah,
the
this was
question.
written
Okay.
in late 2023, I believe.
Okay.
Um, yeah, September of 23. So that's right after the summer.
So I
Um,
bet you're right. I bet you're right.
yes, and I think that's a fair, fair inspiration to take from Oppenheimer. Covers a lot of the same stuff. The investigation of whether or not
Hmm.
he's a communist, that parallels with Kazan, and you have uh, some of the people that Oppenheimer worked with that had their own agenda and their own feud. And I mean, the similar beats are there, only this one is told a little bit more linearly, and Oppenheimer kind of jumps all over the place. But
This one, I think, in my opinion, kind of jumping a little bit before we get to the grading this thing,
mhm,
it seems to focus an awful lot on this play, this movie, this play, this movie, this name, that name, instead of who is this character and who is that character and
mhm.
why should we care? If that was changed, you may have had something here. But it's throwing down names for namesake stories for story's sake, not for actually weaving something that would be interesting into whoever would be watching it.
I agree because I think this type of subject matter, you have three stories that'd be very interesting to cover if you wanted to cover the life of Kazan. The first one would be the time between getting snubbed at the Oscars for Streetcar Named Desire and his struggles afterwards with Hollywood kind of rejecting him for suspicion of communism,
Mm-hmm.
and then coming to the terms of that at the end. That's a better contained story to focus on. The other part of the story would be the aftermath of that. You start with him naming names. You start with him trying to basically say my talent, my skill, and my guile can get me out of the blacklist, and I can make a movie like On the Waterfront and be able to salvage my career and show people that I am an American. There's that story, and then the other story would just be a simple rivalry of a friendship broken between Kazan and Miller. And I thought, based on the log line, that's what we were going to get, but it's it wasn't. It was a little bit of all of those things that I mentioned, kind of just
Right.
blended poorly together.
And you had mentioned something too, which I think is huge, especially in something like this, is most stories people don't want to watch when the bad guy isn't anything that you want to associate with. It's not someone that you're going to have turkey dinner with, you know. It's not someone that you actually root for in the end because you don't.
Right.
These are bad people or mediocre at best, and they remain so, and there's no emotional loss when they have loss, except for the secondary character Molly.
Right. And you know what? Part of me was wondering, could you tell a story from her perspective where we actually are rooting for her, where she has suspicions, but they're assuaged, and then all of a sudden they get
Yep.
confirmed, and your heart breaks along with hers, and you just want, and we see what she does afterwards, because sometimes it's not always the celebrity in the biopic that captures your interest. It's the people that are around them that are either suffer or benefit from their actions, and
You
I
know, that
was
actually could be a real good story written from her point of view.
yeah. I mean, what's kind of crazy is there's a script about Michael Jackson out there that's written from the point of view of Bubbles the chimp,
Right.
and as silly as that concept sounds, there's some real good empathy in that story, and I'm wondering if they're actually gonna if it's gonna be put to screen anytime soon. And this script has been circulating around for a little over shortly after Michael Jackson passed away, sadly.
Mm.
So it's been a while, but yeah, like I will say this, like the script has a couple of brief moments that are like, oh, there's some talent here, but structurally speaking, capturing the fleshing out the characters to capture them from what they are, pretty weak. What about your final thoughts, Adega, before we go to the next stage of this script?
That's it. That's it. I said at the beginning that, this is the fifth story, and three of them were good. One of them wasn't good. But in all of the cases, for me, they actually held my interest a lot better than this, and they were better written. I mean, granted, most of them had spelling errors. This guy did not have any spelling errors at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was the structure of it. You mentioned where there was addresses written all the way out instead of just a vague location of where things were, a street name instead of all the way down to the number of the street. It just odds and ends, little bits and pieces that really distracted from actually pulling in serious interest. It never had that. There was never um, the deep end of the pool. It was always you're wading in little drops of water here and there, but nothing that really pulled it all together and to make something deep and meaningful.
Yeah, and I think it basically relied too much on people who grew up in Hollywood to know these stories as opposed to the general audience. I
And
think that hurt
another
too.
big thing too is what's the relevancy for today? To be honest with you, I don't have an answer. I granted it's history, but for most people, it's someone who wants to slap down $20 to go see a movie. Um, how relevant would that? What kind of an evening would that give them?
Yeah,
You're
I
not
mean,
you're not gonna take a hot date there. It just I don't see it at all.
see, what I would have done with a Kazan's story of this type, or at least addressing this type of situation, is basically do the same thing that Arthur Miller's Crucible did, which is you frame a witch hunt which transcends time, where you have paranoia driving people to look for enemies where there are none, and ignoring the areas where the enemies are actually hiding.
Mm-hmm.
And that could have been something to address here with a bit more thought and care, because that's part of the reputation of the blacklist. Like, yeah, McCarthy was never really 100% after Hollywood, but what he started had a ripple effect that went to Hollywood. And there are some people that were working on his behalf. There are some times where he was there, but again, his focus was mostly on government and other businesses. But there's something to explore there. Like, I mean, if you wanted to compare it to today, you've got, the DEI, the woke stuff that has caused a lot of damage to a lot of people's lives under the guise of trying to open up accessibility to these jobs for people that want it, but maybe don't feel like they're being represented, or are under the misguided belief that they're being rejected for things that have nothing to do with the quality of their work. There's something there that could have been used to parallel this, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that was necessarily on the tip of this writer's mind. I think this was more of probably a passion project that's lacking a little bit of discipline, because you can tell that there's some passion in the writing, but it's all over the place. It's like, I want to explore this story. I want to explore the part of him at the party where he nails Marilyn Monroe. Then I want to explore how Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe fell in love and then got married, and how that kind of ruined his life. Then I want to explore, Bud Schulberg and the cool things that he would say about it. And then I want to talk about Jeffrey Corey and how he was basically helping out Dustin Hoffman and Jack Nicholson and James Dean and all these actors kind of really get into becoming like, the Renaissance of Hollywood. It felt like there's just too many things going on that he wanted to integrate all together into one story without figuring out, like, well, what's the spine of your story? What is your premise? Right. And are you sticking to that premise?
Right.
So with that being said, Adega, would you give this screenplay a green light or a pass?
Oh, this one's pretty easy. No green light, no rewrite, no nothing. Let it go.
No disrespect to the writer. I commend him for getting this far in the blacklist and doing the research on the script, but unfortunately this is a pass for myself. It's too unfocused, and it covers too broad of a period of time, around like 5 to 8 years, really.
Yeah.
And that kind of hurts the momentum, especially with stories of these types. Like, even with Oppenheimer, one of the reasons why I think it worked is because, while it did bounce between different time periods, the spine of that story was focused on the hearing itself and around that hearing. Mm-hmm. And we don't have something like that here at all. It's
no long-term focus anyway, because there's brief little focus. Well, I got to go to the hearing. Brief little focus. Well, I got to get this play written. Brief little focus. Well, I got to go make up with my friend and get some money. But nothing that laced all of it together, except for one day he holds an Oscar too tight, and it has that brief little moment, like you said, where you could see his ugly face in the reflection. But other than that, the threads don't tie.
Exactly. And, it's that's unfortunate, because I think this subject matter has a lot of potential. And I think, there's lots of books written on the subject itself, and that decade post World War II to the early 1950s of, dealing with communism and how it's seeped its way into the Western world was definitely something valid to explore. And also how the witch hunt in itself and the people that got caught up into it when were kicked out kind of hurt the industry, because, as I was saying before the show, the 1950s is a decade of films that are not well revered. Television kind of blew up a little bit at that point, and the people that they kicked out of Hollywood ended up going somewhere else to make a living, and the industry suffered. And it wasn't until they kind of swallowed their pride and focused a bit more
It
on
almost
trying to
took to
make
the
money.
80s.
Yeah.
It almost took to the 80s before things really turned around.
Yeah, because the 60s had their peaks and valleys, but it wasn't steady.
Hmm.
And then the early 70s is when things kind of started to pick up. And we had some great movies that came out of the 70s. You have The Godfather, you have Chinatown, you got Apocalypse Now, of course, Star Wars,
My favorite
Jaws,
Superman.
Superman. And it all kind of it created a foundation that allowed the 80s to be the 80s.
Hmm.
And it took 20 years to get there. so, um, so yeah, I mean there that's a significant point in entertainment history and history in general that could have been explored here. I don't think that's exactly what this writer was trying to do, but he
No,
he definitely touched on a couple of things that piqued my interest to say, oh, I wish we kind of focused a little bit more on this because he kind of captured something here, or um,
it could almost be an allegory for what we're going through now,
yeah,
with all the witch hunts that have been going on for false reasons, and in the recovery time, people like you are gonna do really well
I mean,
when
crossing
the
my fingers.
opportunity.
That's
Yep.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of an inversion here, but it's quite fascinating to see. It's horrible to live through, of course, but there's something to learn about it. And I think even though this script in its condition doesn't you know ignite our engines, so to speak, um, if he could find a new perspective that has a parallel to what's been happening over the last decade, and playing that whole history can repeat itself if you don't learn from the mistakes of your predecessors. There could be something here, but as it
Yeah.
is, all I can say is congrats to Chris for making the blacklist. Now, I did fail to mention at the start of the show, and I apologize, but this placed 55th on the blacklist with 9 votes. Um, it's not in the bottom 10, but it is kind of like in that mid range between 8 and 15 votes. Kind of kits you between places 15 and 60, so it's a wide spread there.
Mm.
But I can see why some people gave this script a vote because it definitely hits a legendary period of Hollywood. It also leans in a little bit to some of the some of the myths and legends of what was happening at that time. So yeah, I can respect that interest, but for me, this script just didn't do it, and it didn't do it for you as well,
No,
David. So
I can't see how it would make an audience with the type of people that are out now, with how people are absorbing information or entertainment. I can't see anything close to this being anything that would make any money.
yeah, I mean, even on a low budget thing, I could see maybe going to streaming, but not having an impact. Sadly, it just not in this current condition. Um, so yeah, that's basically it that I have to say on Kazan. Is there anything more you would like to add before we wrap it for the evening, sir?
No, no, I'm just sorry that I went through the script and it was a little difficult for me to. It wasn't hard to read, but it was just difficult to find meaning for it. And when I got to the conclusion, and also listening to you, I understand why there wasn't any. It was a history. It wasn't a story,
Yeah,
and that was difficult for me. And that's again why this approach, the whole thing needs. If the writer did this, actually wants a story to be told, you got to throw this one away, and then pick a person, pick their motivation, make their heart come out in the story, and then wrap everything else around it. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
good advice. Very good advice. I hope if the writer is listening to this or anyone else who's wanting to write a period piece, whether it's about entertainment or anything else, take that in mind. Find out deep inside what did this character, this person of history, what were they striving to do? What do they want? Why do they want it? Why were they
Mm-hmm.
willing to put everything on the line to achieve it? If you can capture that and convey it on the page, that can be translated to film or television, that will do what you're trying to achieve. That will give you the passion. That will convey your passion through the work. So That's some great advice there. With that, I want to thank you, Adega, for coming on tonight. Always appreciated. Can't wait to
It's
hear
always a
more of your
blast.
thoughts in the future for other scripts down the road as we enter into our second season starting in the new year. With that being said, I want to thank everyone listening live out there in the chat and those who are listening on the recording. As always, guys, we'll be back again next week to cover another script. And if you want to get some advance notice on what we'll be reviewing, you can always sign up to the Patreon. It does come with a free 1 week membership at the base level. And if that is to your liking, with seeing the past articles I've written regarding screenwriting and reviews, as well as the projects and scripts that we'll be reviewing on this show, that support is always greatly appreciated, but not required, because if you can, wonderful. If you can't, no harm, no foul. We'll still be doing this show for all of you wonderful people that are interested in seeing the types of screenplays that are being written by people who are just trying to tell a story that reaches something inside of them. With that being said, I want to wish you all a wonderful weekend and a happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah, happy holidays, the whole spectrum of celebrations that are coming up between now and next week's show. And never forget, guys, when it comes to great story, it all starts with the script.